The strangest thing about that night was not the laughter echoing beneath the crystal chandeliers, nor the way my father stood in the middle of the living room, raising his wine glass as if he were about to declare some truth before the whole town. The strangest thing was that the letter had arrived too late to save me, and yet exactly in time to destroy everything my family had worked so hard to build. My name is Vivian Cole. I was 18 that year. That night was my father's 60th birthday party, and also the night he wanted to show his friends, business partners, and the people on the city council that he had a perfect family, a respected name, and only one daughter truly worth being proud of. The house was filled with the scent of expensive perfume, the clink of glasses, and that elegant but icy kind of laughter. And I, in a simple black dress, was just a quiet shadow passing through them with a tray of drinks in my hands. Then the doorbell rang. A courier envelope was brought in while all eyes were still on my father. My mother took it and opened it with complete indifference. And then her face went pale, as if she had just seen something that should not exist in this world. Her hand shook so badly the paper almost slipped to the floor. But to understand why a thin envelope could make a woman like my mother nearly collapse right there in the foyer, you have to understand how I grew up in the house that carried the Cole name. And if somewhere in this story you hear a piece of your own life in it, stay with me until the end. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel. I'd also love to hear where you're listening from, and whether you have ever known what it feels like to grow up invisible inside your own family. In ordinary families, children grow up on love. In mine, we grew up on ranking. No one ever said that out loud, of course. In wealthy suburbs like North Shore, Illinois, people do not need to say cruel things too clearly. They only need to repeat them often enough through their eyes, through the way seats are assigned at the dinner table, through who gets mentioned in front of guests, and who gets told to stay quiet so the room looks more peaceful. My father, Grant Cole, ran a fairly large branding and communications company in the area. He did not walk into a room the way ordinary men did. He walked in as if the room had belonged to him long before he arrived. His voice was low and steady, always carrying that firm tone of someone used to giving orders and being obeyed. At the office, people called him visionary. At home, that vision was much simpler. Everything had to serve the image he wanted to preserve. My mother, Diane Cole, was the kind of woman who could smile at someone at a charity fundraiser and then immediately turn away to straighten a tablecloth because it looked less than half an inch off. She loved gleaming kitchens, crystal glasses without a single fingerprint, brunches at the country club, and compliments like, "Diane, your house always looks like it belongs in a magazine." Some women want to be loved. My mother seemed to prefer being admired. And then there was my sister, Madison Cole. Madison was 2 years older than I was, with golden hair, a bright smile, and a way of appearing in pictures as if she always knew exactly where the camera was. She had a gift for arranging herself into whatever people most wanted to believe about her. To my parents, she was not just the older daughter. She was the version of life they could put on display. I was different, quieter, more withdrawn, dark-haired, and never the kind of girl my mother was proud to walk into a crowded room with. I did not know how to say things sweetly enough to win over adults. I did not know how to laugh at exactly the right moment to soften the atmosphere. I only learned how to watch and then stay silent. Right in the main hallway on the first floor was a large photo wall. Every guest who came to the house passed it. On that wall was Madison through the years. Madison in her cheer uniform, Madison at prom, Madison holding flowers at graduation, Madison smiling beside my mother at a fundraiser, Madison with her arm linked through my father's at a company holiday party. I was in there somewhere too, but only in a few family pictures, standing off to one side, small and dark like part of the background that people only noticed if they looked carefully. One time I stood staring at that wall long enough for my mother to walk by and ask, "What are you doing?" I said, "Just looking." She adjusted Madison's frame without looking at me. "If you moved a little out of the way, it would look neater." She said it so lightly, almost unconsciously. But there are some things people say that do not need to be harsh to stay with you for a very long time. In my house, Madison was forgiven before she even made mistakes. Sometimes she was practically rewarded for them. If her grades were low, my father said school pressure was too much. If she was rude, my mother said she was just sensitive. If she broke something, the whole family revolved around her as if she were the one who had been hurt most. Me, even when I did everything right, I usually got only silence. A silence so steady that after a while, it became the most familiar sound of my childhood. I did not grow up like a daughter in that house. I grew up as the part of the picture no one thought mattered. And when people treat you that way long enough, you begin to notice everything they overlook. They believed they were reducing me. What they were really doing was teaching me how to build a life without asking to be seen. After a while, I stopped expecting anyone in that house to notice me. Not all at once, but slowly, the way water wears down stone. Every good grade, every kind word from a teacher, every attempt to say something at dinner ended the same way. Their attention passed over me and moved on. Eventually, I stopped offering pieces of myself where they were never wanted. I kept them to myself instead. My high school years passed in two completely different worlds. By day, I was Vivian Cole, the quiet girl sitting near the window, always turning in assignments on time, always earning nearly perfect grades, but rarely ever mentioned at home. In the afternoons and evenings, I changed into an apron at a small diner not far from school, pouring coffee, wiping tables, taking orders, smiling at regulars who left spare change in the glass tip jar by the register. The diner smelled like melted butter, dark roasted coffee, and maple syrup sticking to tabletops at the end of a shift. There were nights I came home with my hair still smelling like fryer oil, my feet aching, my head spinning, and yet carrying this strange feeling inside me. At least that money was mine. At least there was one piece of my future I was touching with my own hands. I saved almost every dollar. No new clothes, no weekends out, no ordering anything expensive at the diner. It took me almost a year to buy a used laptop, with a scratched-up shell and a battery so weak it had to stay plugged in almost all the time. I still remember exactly how it felt bringing it back to my room, setting it on my desk, opening it under the small yellow light beside my bed. To someone else, it was just a second-hand device. To me, it felt like a door. I started teaching myself to code from the most basic lessons, then gradually went deeper into the things that pulled me in so completely I could hardly stop. Data science, behavioral prediction, consumer patterns, models that could explain why people made the decisions they made. I loved the feeling that the world had finally given me one place that ran on logic. Data did not love one person more than another. Numbers were not biased. If I did something right, the result appeared. If there was an error, I could trace it, fix it, do it again. A computer never looked at me like I was the less appealing version of Madison. Later, I found a small online community where STEM students from all over traded problems, projects, ideas, and sleepless nights. I used an ordinary nickname, never posted photos, never said anything about my family. There, for the first time, people responded to me because of what I thought, not because of who I was or what I looked like. There was one person in the group, a little older than the rest of us, who never said much, but always read what I posted very carefully. One night I uploaded an unfinished model, and said myself that it was probably still too rough to call good. He replied with just one sentence. People who are underestimated learn to build in silence. I read that line over and over. Maybe that is why the one time I still tried to place a piece of myself in front of my family became the memory I remember most clearly. That day I brought home a report card full of straight A's. I laid it neatly on the kitchen counter before I left for work, saying nothing, just foolishly thinking that if my father saw it, maybe he would pause for a moment. Maybe he would say, "Good job, Viv." Just one sentence like that would have been enough. When I came back after my shift, the paper was no longer on the counter. I found it in the trash can by the back door, the edge curled from water. My mother's white orchid pot from earlier that afternoon had been set on top of it so the counter would not get wet. I stood there for a long time, staring at the faint smear of dirt on one corner of the page, and then picked it up. My mother walked in at that exact moment, looked over my shoulder, and said casually, "If that was something you wanted to keep, next time don't leave it on the counter." I thought it was scrap paper. That was the day I understood something very clearly. If I wanted to escape that house, no one was going to open the door for me. I would have to make the key myself. I used to think being underestimated was the worst thing. I was wrong. The worst thing was the day I realized that, in my family's eyes, my future had never really belonged to me. It was only something that could be bargained away, transferred, and placed into Madison's hands if her life started to crack. That evening fell in the middle of the week, cold and quiet like so many others in North Shore. I had just gotten home from the diner and had not even taken off my coat when my phone buzzed. The message in the family group chat had only one line from my father. Dining room, 7 o'clock. Don't be late. In my house, messages like that never meant anything normal. They were always commands wrapped in calmness. I looked at the time, looked at my shoes still damp from the rain, then went upstairs to wash my hands, brush my hair, and walk down the stairs with that familiar feeling of someone preparing to hear something that would not end well for her. My father was already sitting at the head of the table when I walked in. My mother sat to his right, her hands folded together, her wedding ring lightly tapping the side of her glass. Madison sat across from me, her eyes red, though her makeup was still carefully preserved in the way only people who know they are being watched can manage. Beside her sat Preston Hale, the perfect fiancé in my parents' eyes. Polished, wealthy, from the right kind of family, speaking with just enough confidence to sound trustworthy. No one invited me to sit. I pulled my own chair back, the legs scraping softly across the hardwood floor in the heavy silence of the room. My father spoke first, his voice composed the way it always was at the start of a board meeting. This family is at a delicate stage. Your sister needs support, and the first thing we need to do is handle everything with maturity. I turned toward Madison. She lifted a tissue to the corner of her eye, took in just enough breath to sound fragile. My mother leaned forward as if she had been assigned the compassionate role in that little performance. Madison has had a very difficult semester, she said. The pressure at school was more than she expected. Things got out of hand. You know how sensitive she is. I said nothing. My father continued, more briefly and more accurately. Madison's grades had collapsed. She had missed too many classes, burned through her fall tuition money on things no one in that room wanted to call by their real name, and now the school was threatening suspension unless the remaining balance was paid. At the same time, the engagement had already been announced. The wedding plans with the Hale family were moving forward, and the reputation of both families was not something that could be allowed to slip just because of a difficult stage. She can't handle one more shock right now, my mother said softly, her eyes lowered to the table, as if that sentence alone excused Madison from all responsibility. What your sister needs right now is protection. I heard Preston step in with a voice so gentle it was cold. Sometimes in a family, the stronger person has to step back so the more fragile one doesn't break. I looked up at him. I did not know whether he truly believed that or was simply repeating the same language my family always used to turn selfishness into morality. My father laid both hands on the table. So, he said, we have decided that Madison will withdraw from her current program, take a semester off, stabilize emotionally, and prepare for the wedding. But in order to make that happen, the family has to rearrange its priorities. I understood before he finished the sentence. A cold feeling slid quietly from the back of my neck down my spine. You will cancel your applications to the top schools, my father said. Next year, you will start at the local community college. Then we'll see from there. It is more reasonable, more economical, and more suited to your abilities. He paused for half a beat, then went on in the tone of someone assigning an obvious task. And the money you have saved will be transferred to Madison. She needs it to cover the tuition balance and get through this stage. I looked from one face to the next. Not one of them looked like they believed they had just said something cruel. My mother even softened her voice as if she were comforting me. Vivian, you're the kind of child who can start over. Your sister isn't. That sentence was what made everything inside me go still. Not because it was loud, not because it surprised me, but because it was so true. So precisely true to the way they had always seen me. In their eyes, I was not a girl with dreams, with plans, with a door I had built a key for by myself. I was the piece that could be cut away without ruining the larger picture. The backup source. The reasonable sacrifice to save the daughter they actually loved. Madison finally spoke, her voice trembling as if she were the one on the operating table. I know you think I want this, Viv, but you can see the situation. You're always fine. You always manage on your own. Hearing that, I felt something inside my chest reach its final limit. I had once believed the deepest pain was when people laughed at your dreams. But no, the deepest pain is when they look directly at those dreams, weigh them in their hands like an object, and decide to trade them for someone else's comfort. There are some laughs people forget by morning. And then there are the ones that stay with you for years. I do not remember how deeply I breathed before I opened my mouth. I only remember how strangely quiet the room had become, that kind of quiet that tells you something is about to crack. I looked at my father first, then my mother, then Madison, and for the first time in years, I did not choose silence just to keep the peace for other people. I am not canceling my applications, I said, my voice calmer than what I was feeling inside. I already submitted them. My grades are enough, my essays are enough, my application is enough. And I did not apply to the local community college. My father leaned back slightly. Then where did you apply? I swallowed, but I did not look away. MIT and Caltech. For the first 3 seconds no one said anything. It was the kind of brief, sharp silence that feels like the moment before someone throws a glass onto the floor. Then my father laughed. Not the polite kind of laugh people use to release tension. Not even the startled kind people make when they hear something hard to believe. He laughed loudly, tipping his head back, one hand pressed to his chest as if I had said the funniest thing he had heard all week. That laugh filled the dining room, bounced off the wooden table, struck walls that had heard far too many judgments in that house. And the worst part was not just that he laughed. It was that he laughed as if my dream was not real enough to deserve opposition. It was only real enough to entertain him. My tea? He repeated, still laughing. Vivian, do you hear yourself? Madison blinked very slowly, then tilted her head, one corner of her mouth lifting in that familiar way she used whenever she wanted to make someone feel small. Oh my God, she said, almost sighing it out. Are you serious? You do realize that place is for people who are actually exceptional, not for girls trying to prove something because they're mad at their family. Preston lifted his water glass slightly, his voice smooth and polite enough to sound almost kind if you did not listen carefully. Vivian, not everyone needs to chase places like that. The world still needs reliable people to answer phones, manage schedules, pour coffee, work as assistants. There's nothing shameful about a practical life. I turned to look at him. Are you done? The smile on Preston's mouth faltered, but my mother cut in before he had to answer. That's enough. She pressed a hand to her forehead as if I were the one exhausting her. Vivian, stop making this bigger than it is. You're inventing a ridiculous story just to avoid facing the fact that your family needs you to do the right thing. MIT? Caltech? Do you realize how absurd that sounds? I did not know what inside me hardened in that moment. Maybe it was the final piece of me that had still hoped they might see me as a real person, not an object that could be moved around to salvage Madison's life. I laid both hands on my lap so they would not see them shaking. I'm not inventing anything, I said, more quietly now, but each word was clear. I have the grades, I have the application, I have what it takes to apply to those places. My father stopped laughing, only for his face to become colder. Whenever he looked at me with that expression, I always felt as if I were standing in front of a steel door just swinging shut. Fine, he said. If you want to talk about reality, then let's talk about reality. You can apply to whatever schools you want. But no school solves money with fantasy. He leaned forward slightly, his voice slow and firm. I will not sign a single financial form. I will not support your application. I will not provide income information. I will not verify anything. I will not spend 1 penny on this imaginary game. And if you think you can stand against this family and still keep living under this roof as if nothing happened, then you are mistaken. My mother inhaled softly, not in shock, but in relief, that someone else had finally said what she wanted said. Madison lowered her eyes, but I could see the satisfaction still sitting at the corner of her mouth. My father spoke the last sentence without raising his voice at all. "If you do not comply, you can pack your things and leave." I lowered my eyes, let my shoulders droop, exactly the way they expected. I let the silence stretch just long enough for them to believe I had finally understood my place. On the outside, I looked crushed. Inside, something very still was rising. Because what they did not know was that I had stopped following the path they imagined months earlier. I had read enough to understand that a family like mine could use money like a choke chain, and I had quietly found another route, a separate application, an independent merit program, a door that did not need my father's signature, did not need my mother's kindness, and certainly did not need permission from anyone sitting in that room. I lifted my head and made my voice sound small and tired. "I understand." My father nodded at once, like a man who had just put out a small fire before it reached the curtains. My mother relaxed her shoulders. Madison leaned back in her chair, her face softening with the satisfaction of someone restored to the center. The meeting ended as quickly as it had begun, as if my future were just a minor agenda item that had been voted on and settled in the middle of a weekday evening. I went upstairs, closed my bedroom door, leaned against it for a few seconds without turning on the light. The darkness in my room felt familiar, like an old blanket. I set my bag on the floor, sat on the edge of the bed, and finally let the tears fall. Not the kind of crying that comes out loud, and not because I still expected anyone to come comfort me. It was only that my body had held something painful for too long, and it had to find a way out. I do not know how long I sat there like that. I only know that when my phone screen lit up in the dark room, I nearly jumped. A new message from the mentor in my online community. No greeting, no questions, just one short sentence, as if he somehow knew exactly what had happened. "Whatever they do, don't tell them everything." I stared at that line for a long time. Downstairs, I could still hear glasses lightly touching, chairs shifting, my family continuing their evening as though they had just handled some minor inconvenience. And I sat in the dark, the phone screen casting a dim light over my hands. And for the first time since the evening had begun, I felt my heartbeat slowing. Maybe they thought they had blocked every road I could take. Maybe they believed my father's laughter had been the final period at the end of the sentence. But there are things you should not reveal too soon, especially to people who think power means the right to control someone else's future. And that night, in the smallest room of the biggest house I had ever lived in, I understood that secrecy was no longer the place where I hid. It was the thing that would help me survive. The most dangerous moment in a house full of arrogance is the moment they believe they have broken you. Because from that second on, they become careless. They stop watching. They stop looking closely. And it was exactly that smugness that gave me the only thing I needed through the months that followed. Space to quietly prepare my way out. The next 3 months passed like a winter that would not end. On the surface, everything in my house seemed to fall back into its old order. My father began leaving community college brochures on the dining table, on the kitchen counter, even on the passenger seat of the car, as if seeing them often enough would make my future shrink on its own to fit his vision. Once, he even tapped one brochure with his finger while reading the paper and said in a tone so casual it almost sounded kind, "This is the practical choice." People who know their limits usually hurt less later on. My mother, meanwhile, shifted more of the house staff's work onto me anytime we had guests. She never said outright that it was punishment. She just used that soft, cold voice of hers. "Vivian, rearrange the cheese tray." "Vivian, make sure you check the downstairs bathroom before people arrive." "Vivian, don't wear such dark colors, they make you look heavy." She spoke as if she were adjusting some decorative detail that was not quite right. I did it all without arguing, without asking questions. Not because I was obedient, only because I had learned that sometimes silence at the right time is not surrender. It is saving strength for another battle. Madison moved through the house with the shimmering confidence of someone the family had just assured was still the center of every priority. She talked on the phone about wedding dresses, guest lists, and new plans with Preston, as if school had been nothing more than a passing gust of wind. Sometimes she looked at me with something close to pity. "Are you okay, Viv?" she asked one morning when she saw me getting ready for work. "I know changing your college plans isn't easy, but eventually you'll see Dad was right." I buttoned my coat and looked at her through the hallway mirror. "I'm sure you have more to worry about than I do right now." Madison paused for a second, then gave a thin smile. "You always talk like that. Like you see things other people don't." I said nothing. There are times when truth does not need to be spoken out loud to make people uncomfortable. I kept working at the diner, still standing for hours beneath warm yellow lights, listening to the hiss of the espresso machine and customers asking for another slice of pie, still letting my body clock run on evening shifts and sleepless nights. The only difference was that when I came back to my room, I no longer opened my laptop out of hope. I opened it like someone finishing the last bridge before cutting off the shore behind her. The project I worked on during that time was a predictive model that helped small businesses track buying shifts based on region, weather, holidays, and weekly consumer rhythms, so they could optimize inventory without overstocking or running short. It sounded dry, but to me, it felt like final proof that all those hours I had quietly lived in the dark had not been meaningless. There were nights the screen stayed bright until almost dawn, my eyes burning, my neck and shoulders aching, but when I watched the data finally fall into place, when the model began producing its first results cleanly and beautifully enough, something inside me settled. I sent the finished application to the Merit Fellowship program over the weak Wi-Fi in my bedroom, my hands still shaking from fear that my father might suddenly open the door. After I hit submit, I sat there for a long time, listening only to the heater running below the floor and the wind brushing lightly against the window frame. Other than my online mentor, there was only one other person who knew what I was waiting for. Ellen Park, my former high school counselor, was the one person who had looked at my academic file longer than anyone in my family ever had. When I told her quietly that I was afraid my parents might intercept anything sent to the house, she did not pity me. She simply nodded, pulled a sheet of paper closer, and wrote down her office address. "Send everything you can here," she said. "But be careful. Some final admissions packets and fellowship documents are mailed separately through priority courier services. If the address update doesn't process in time, they may still go to your original home address." I nodded. "I just need it to arrive somewhere." She looked at me steadily. "No, what you need is to get out of that house and still remain yourself." That sentence stayed with me much longer than I expected. From then on, I stopped measuring time by the calendar and started measuring it by the distance between me and the exit. I no longer waited for my father to look at me with pride, not even once. I no longer waited for my mother to realize she had 2 daughters in that house, not one. Those expectations fell off me slowly. But once they were gone, what remained was not emptiness the way I had feared. What remained was a kind of cold, bright focus. I no longer needed their approval. I only needed to leave that house whole, before they took the last thing that still belonged to me. If they wanted to turn me into a server at the most glorious evening of their lives, I would let them. Because sometimes if you want to watch an empire collapse, you have to stand very close to it. The party was held on a Saturday night, right in our house, in the house my mother liked to call beautiful enough to host anyone. From early that morning, the place had been full of sound. Event staff moving around, glasses clinking, doors opening and closing, the sharp click of my mother's heels across the marble floor as she walked from room to room, checking every tiny detail. Tall white floral arrangements were carried into the foyer. Long lines of candles were set down the dining table, reflecting soft gold onto the silverware. A string quartet arrived nearly an hour before guests to tune, and the smell of hot food drifting from the kitchen spread through the first floor, rich enough to almost overpower the expensive perfume of the guests beginning to arrive before it was fully dark outside. It was my father's 60th birthday, but anyone looking in would have understood that this was not just a birthday party. It was a performance. A stage set so that friends, business partners, loyal clients, and people in the same social and business circles could walk in, raise a glass, and leave with the feeling that Grant Cole was the sort of man who had built everything. The company, the name, the status, and a family other people should envy. Around 6 o'clock, just as I came downstairs in a simple black dress, my mother turned and looked me up and down. Her eyes lingered on me longer than usual, not with emotion, but with the expression of someone evaluating an object that was out of place. "No," she said immediately. "You cannot stand with the family tonight looking like that." I stopped. Looking like what? That overly quiet expression. She stepped closer and adjusted the shoulder of my dress as if smoothing out a wrinkle. "Tonight requires warmth, brightness, the right kind of presence. You don't have the right energy for this guest list. It would be better if you just helped the service staff. That would feel more natural." More natural. She said it so gently, as though she were solving some social awkwardness for me, not quietly pushing me out of the picture-perfect family image she had spent weeks arranging. I looked over her shoulder and saw Madison coming down the staircase in a champagne-colored silk dress that hugged her perfectly, her hair elaborately styled, her face lit beneath the chandeliers as if she had been born for rooms like this. My mother smiled the moment she saw her. "Perfect?" she said softly. "Not to me." And so I picked up a tray of glasses and moved among guests in tailored suits and women wearing jewelry that flashed with every turn of the wrist. I poured champagne, collected used napkins, bent down to pick up a fallen fork near an armchair by the fireplace. No one really looked at me for long. They only held out a glass, offered a polite smile if necessary, then went right back to their conversations about the market, yachts, their children's colleges, ski trips to Aspen, stocks, and spring home renovations. There was something oddly relieving about being mistaken for waitstaff. At least that role was clearer than my role as the second daughter in my own house. Madison, meanwhile, moved through the crowd like a fish in water. She laughed at the right moments, touched people lightly on the arm when she spoke, tilted her head just enough to seem interested. I overheard her telling a group of my mother's friends about a new position at a partner agency, the job my father had arranged to cover over her academic collapse with a title that sounded elegant enough. "It's been intense," she said with a carefully practiced humble smile, "but I've always loved working in high-standard environments." People praised her resilience. Others said she was just like my father. I passed by carrying a tray of hot appetizers and heard every word land like tiny splinters of glass. Close to 9 o'clock, my father signaled for the musicians to stop. The room's conversation slowed and then settled into silence. He stood near the foot of the curved staircase in the foyer, lifting his glass, his face warm with alcohol and with the thing that intoxicated him most: attention. Everyone turned to look. My mother stood half a step away, shoulders straight, smile perfect. Madison stood on the other side, beautiful and glowing as if she had been born to be placed under light. I stood at the edge of the room, near the entrance to the kitchen, still holding the silver tray, now nearly empty. My father began to speak about gratitude, about building a career, about legacy, about family, about the values that had guided him through the years. Every word was polished, confident, familiar, like a speech he had delivered in his mind many times before saying it out loud. He mentioned my mother as the pillar of the household. He mentioned friends, partners, people who had stood beside him through the years. Then he turned to Madison, raised his glass toward her with a smile warmer and wider than anything I had ever seen him give me. "And Madison," he said, his voice full of pride, "the daughter who understands excellence." There were a few soft laughs, a few approving nods. Madison lowered her head slightly, pretending to be humble, but her eyes lit up as if she had just been restored to her rightful throne. I stood still where I was, hearing those words pass straight through me, quietly and cleanly. It did not hurt in any new way anymore. It only sounded like confirmation of a pain that had been there too long. My father did not mention my name once. He raised his glass higher. Everyone else followed. Crystal touched crystal in that bright, beautiful house, controlled down to every tiny detail. And at that exact moment, the doorbell rang. The sound was not loud, but it was sharp. It cut through the polished atmosphere like a thin crack across glass. One of the servers near the front opened the door. I looked that way almost on instinct. On the porch stood a delivery driver in a dark jacket, holding a priority courier envelope that required a signature. The porch light caught the stiff white surface of the package, making the bold lettering stand out in exactly the way I had imagined for weeks. The server hesitated, then turned to find someone. My mother was closest to the door. She stepped forward to take it, wearing the impatient expression of a hostess, interrupted during the most important moment of the evening. But the instant she tore open the edge of the envelope, it was not just my father who saw. Two of his closest guests standing near the console table in the foyer also turned by accident. One was a longtime business partner. The other was the wife of a city council member, the type of woman who glanced quickly but remembered everything. My mother pulled the paper from inside and scanned the first few lines. Then her entire face changed. Not the kind of mild surprise people show at an unexpected gift, but the very real blanching of someone who has just seen something capable of knocking an entire room off the axis she spent years building. Her hand shook so badly the edge of the page brushed against her wrist. The woman standing nearby blinked and stared directly at her face. My father lowered his glass. His smile was still there, but it had gone stiff at the edges. And I stayed where I was in the corner, the silver tray cold in my hands, feeling the air around me shift in a way no one in that house yet fully understood. Some truths do not need to be shouted. They only need to be read out loud, in the right room, in front of the right people who have lived too long off a lie. My mother was still holding the letter when my father walked over. He did not ask what she had seen. He simply took the letter from her with the instinct of a man who had always believed that as long as he controlled the room, he controlled the story. The smile on his face had not vanished. It had only gone rigid at the edges. He adjusted his glasses, glanced at the header, and began reading aloud with the easy arrogance of someone who could not imagine a piece of paper embarrassing him in his own house. Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He stopped for the briefest second. The space around him changed instantly, as if someone had lowered the room's temperature by several degrees. Those standing closest unconsciously leaned in. I saw one business couple stop their conversation altogether. Behind them, even the clinking of glasses fell silent. My father continued reading, but his voice was no longer full and steady the way it had been when he was toasting. Dear Vivian Cole, we're delighted to offer you admission to the incoming class. Someone near my mother drew in a soft breath. I could not tell whether it was her or Madison. I stayed where I was, my heart pounding, my mind strangely clear. I had imagined this moment so many times that when it finally came, it did not feel like thunder. It felt like a door opening. My father turned to the next sheet. I saw his hand tighten around the edge of the paper. Additionally, he read, more slowly now, you have been selected for the Hawthorne Merit Fellowship, a full academic scholarship covering tuition, room, board, and a renewable annual research grant. A woman standing near the staircase lifted a hand to her mouth. The man beside her, one of my father's longtime business partners, spoke very softly, but in a room that quiet, enough people still heard it. Wait, your daughter built that herself? My father did not answer. I think that was the first moment he truly understood what was happening. Not when he saw the school name. Not even when he saw the words, full scholarship. But when he was forced to stand in his own house, in front of the very people he most wanted to impress, and realize that someone had just asked him a question he could not answer about the daughter who had lived under his roof for 18 years. He turned to the last note. It was the short letter from the admissions board. The one thing I had barely dared hope would be included. I knew what it said. I had read the digital copy on the portal so many times I could nearly recite it, but hearing my father read it out loud was something else entirely. Applicants like Vivian are rare. Her work shows the kind of original reasoning we hope will shape the future of this field. He stopped at the final word. No one said anything for several seconds after that. The air in my house, always polished by money, crystal, warm lighting, and string music, suddenly felt fragile in a way I had never known. as if one stronger breath from anyone in that room might shatter the whole perfect evening. Madison was the first to break the silence. That can't be right. Her voice was no longer soft, it was high and rushed. She stepped forward and nearly snatched the letter from my father's hand. No, this has to be wrong. Vivian can't possibly. I watched her hand tremble as she scanned each line. Her eyes moved faster and faster, as if reading quickly enough could turn the truth into a typo. This is insane, she said, but now it sounded more like she was trying to convince herself. There is no way she got into this place. They must have sent it to the wrong person. Or, she looked up at me, her face full of panic and fury. Or you got someone to fake this. My mother turned to her quickly. Madison. But her voice no longer had the force she always used to silence me whenever I said something inconvenient. She, too, was trying to cling to anything that might still salvage the image of the night, and she knew it was slipping away, piece by piece. I still did not move toward them. I did not take the letter back. I did not say I told you so. I simply stood at the edge of the room where they had placed me from the beginning of the evening and watched each layer of confidence slide off their faces. The humiliation was not that I was more talented than they had believed. The humiliation was that the entire room had just witnessed a much simpler and more brutal truth. My father, who loved to talk about legacy, family, and values, had absolutely no idea who I was. I had once believed the truth would shame them. I did not expect it to make them greedy. By the time the last guest left and the front door finally closed, with the sounds of cars fading from the driveway, the whole house had sunk into the kind of heavy silence that comes after an explosion. The string quartet had been gone for a while. Half-finished champagne glasses still sat on the low tables beside the sofas. A white cloth napkin lay crooked beneath a chair, as if someone had stood too quickly and left it behind. Everything was still beautiful, still bright, still expensive, but the air in the house had changed completely. The polished image my mother had spent all evening protecting now felt so thin that one wrong word would tear it apart. I was still standing near the console table in the foyer, the letter back in my hands, though I could not even remember exactly when that had happened. My mother kept walking between the living room and the kitchen, as if searching for some task to keep her from having to face what had just happened. Madison sat on the edge of the sofa, mascara slightly smeared at the corners of her eyes, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She no longer looked like the girl who had just been introduced as the daughter who understands excellence. But hers was not the face of awakening. It was the face of someone who had just been dragged out of the center and did not know how to breathe in the dark. My father stood by the fireplace, one hand braced against the marble mantel, the other holding a glass of whiskey with the ice nearly melted. He did not look at me right away. He stared into the empty space in front of him for a long moment, as if rearranging numbers in his head. And during those few brief seconds, the last naive part of me still whispered something so foolish it hurt. Maybe this time he would turn to me, really look at me and say the one sentence I had been waiting for almost my whole life to hear. I'm proud of you. Just that one sentence. But when my father finally turned, he looked at me the way a man looks at an unexpected variable in the middle of a negotiation. No pride. No regret. Not even the faintest sign of tenderness. Just calculation. All right, he said first, his voice already steady again, already cold. We need to discuss this like adults. I said nothing. He set down his glass and walked slowly closer. Your tuition is fully funded now. Housing is covered as well, which means the money you saved is no longer necessary for school in the way originally thought. I looked at him, not because I failed to understand, but because I still wanted him to say it with his own mouth. Madison still needs help resolving the balance at school, he continued. And if your fellowship includes a yearly research stipend, then frankly, that is far too much money for an 18-year-old. Some of it should come back to the family. After everything that happened tonight, that would also be the reasonable thing. I felt my fingertips go cold around the edge of the envelope. My mother finally stopped pacing. Grant, she said softly, though not to stop him, only to make the tone sound gentler. Then she turned to me. Vivian, at the very least you need to understand what tonight caused. How many people saw that? How many people are going to talk about it? I'm not blaming you for succeeding, but you cannot put your family in that position and then act as if you have no responsibility. I looked at her, stunned by the clean, sharp clarity of disappointment that moved through me. She truly was not going to apologize. She was not going to ask how I had done it. She was not going to ask how long I had been working in silence. The only thing hurting her was that other people had seen her family split open beneath the lights. Madison let out a thin, shaky laugh. "I can't believe this," she said, eyes red, her voice thick with jealousy. "You have everything now and it still isn't enough? You had to wait until this night to bring it out? You knew how important tonight was for the family." "Bring it out?" I repeated, very softly. "You know that's not exactly what I mean," she said quickly, getting more tangled in the bitterness rising through her. "But you could have told us sooner. You could have said it in private. You didn't need to make everyone look at me like—" She stopped, then turned away. "Like I'm some kind of joke." My father cut in, and the sentence that followed was what finally broke something in me for good. "If you had told us sooner," he said, each word dropping into the room with perfect clarity, "we could have handled this privately." I did not answer right away. I just stood there, looking at each of them beneath the warm lighting of the house they had spent a lifetime making beautiful. And then I understood. Not in the way of a passing thought, in the way of something sharp, sinking straight into bone. They were not hurting because they had wounded me. They were not ashamed because they had laughed at my dream. They were not shattered by the realization that they had never known the daughter living under their roof. The only thing making them panic was that other people had seen it. They had not loved me the wrong way. They had not made some tragic misunderstanding. This was not a sorrowful mistake. This was who they were. My father kept speaking, his voice tight again as if he were finalizing terms in a contract. "You owe this family a minimum level of decency, Vivian. You humiliated your parents in front of business partners, friends, our entire community. The least you can do is make up for it by behaving like an adult from now on." I heard my own voice ask, very calmly, "You mean give Madison the money?" "What I mean," he said, "is do the sensible thing." I nodded once. Not because I agreed. Only because I had finally seen the whole truth clearly, without fog, without misplaced hope blurring it anymore. "No." This time the word left my mouth without shaking, without breaking, without having to be pulled up from despair. It stood there in that room, strangely solid, as if it had been waiting for exactly this moment for a very long time. My father blinked. "What did you say?" I looked straight at him. "I will not give Madison my savings. I will not give anyone a portion of my stipend. I do not owe this family the right to shrink myself so other people can feel comfortable." My mother sucked in a breath. "Vivian, don't be dramatic. Not one person in this house," I said, still keeping my voice level, "has asked me how I did any of this. No one has apologized. No one has congratulated me. Dad just calculated what he could take from it. Mom only cares what people are going to say. And Madison still thinks the worst thing about tonight is that she is no longer the only one being seen." Madison jumped to her feet. "You are so selfish." I turned toward her. "No. I just stopped sacrificing myself so you could feel important." My father took one step closer, lowering his voice to that dangerous tone that had always frightened everyone most. "If you walk out of this house tonight with that attitude, do not expect to come back." I looked at him for a long time. Then I realized what made me so calm. That threat had lost every ounce of power. You cannot truly throw someone out of a place their heart has already left. I did not argue anymore. I tightened my grip on the envelope, turned, and walked upstairs. Behind me, my mother called my name once, my father said something sharp and brief, Madison started crying louder, but all of it sounded as if it were happening in another house. I went into my room, opened the closet, took out the old duffel bag I kept under the bed, and packed in a few sets of clothes. My laptop, charger, wallet, notebook, and the letter. Only the things I knew for certain were mine. When I came back downstairs, the house was still glowing. Still elegant, still beautiful, like a postcard of a successful suburban American family. I walked past the photo wall in the hallway, where Madison smiled from dozens of different frames, while I was only some unwanted detail in a distant corner. I stopped for 1 second, not to feel sad, but to remind myself that there are places that will always keep an image of you, but will never hold the real person. Then I opened the front door. January wind hit my face, cold and clean. I stepped off the porch, holding the bag a little tighter against me, and for the first time in my life, I did not leave that house like a daughter being cast out. I left it like a woman choosing her own life. 10 years earlier, my father had laughed until he nearly choked on his drink when he heard the name of the school I dreamed of. 10 years later, he went silent inside a soundproof glass conference room when the assistant standing beside me opened the door and said clearly, "Your meeting is ready, Miss Cole." The years between those two moments were not beautiful in any cinematic way. They were not built out of one perfect act of revenge. They were built out of stretches so long and difficult that sometimes I wondered if I had only traded one form of survival for another. I studied as if I slowed down for even a second, the door that had opened for me would slam shut. I lived on class schedules, side jobs, research papers, sleepless nights in front of a screen, and the quiet fear that if I were not good enough, I would be dragged back to where I had started. But one semester passed, then another. The projects I had once built in secret on that old laptop began to take shape. One small algorithm became a useful platform. That platform took years to refine, fund, rebuild, and prove. Eventually it grew into a company of its own. And after a long stretch of work that consumed more of my life than anything else ever had, it was acquired for enough that I knew I would never again need anyone's permission to exist. I moved to Boston, and I stayed there. I invested, built more, kept my name out of the press as much as I could, changed my number, changed my address, and cut off every road that could lead back home. Not because I was still afraid, but because I no longer wanted my life bent out of shape by people who only remembered my name when they needed something. Somewhere along the way, I heard that Preston had disappeared from Madison's life long before any wedding ever happened. So that morning, when the pitch file of an agency on the verge of collapse landed on my desk, at first it looked like just another deal among dozens waiting for review. I opened the file, skimmed the financial reports, the collapsing client retention, the swelling short-term debt, the operations running like an old house held up by rotting beams. Then my eyes stopped on the executive team section. CEO? Grant Cole. VP of Operations, Madison Cole. I sat there for a long time. Outside the windows, Boston was gray and cold like every other early winter morning. Inside my office, the heat hummed so quietly it was almost inaudible. But something in the air had changed. Not because I was hurting, not because I felt triumphant, only because of the strange sensation of a door I had locked years ago suddenly being knocked on from the other side by people who had no idea who was sitting inside. I pressed the intercom. "Sarah." My assistant's voice came almost immediately. "Yes, ma'am." "I want the camera feed from conference room B." The screen came up. My father sat at the head of the long table, his hair much grayer now, shoulders still trying to hold themselves straight, though no longer with the certainty of the man he used to be. Madison sat to his right, dressed beautifully, every gesture carefully composed, but her hands gripped the folder in front of her far too tightly. They did not look like people coming in from a position of equal strength. They looked like people who had gone too far into desperation to keep their pride fully intact. Sarah's voice came again. "Would you like me to send in the managing partner first?" I kept watching the screen for a few more seconds. "No. I'll go in myself." When the conference room door opened, both of them looked up at the same time. The moment my father recognized me, his face went almost blank for the first few seconds. I had seen many kinds of silence in my life, but the silence that fell over him then was one of the few that truly made a room shrink. Madison blinked repeatedly, as if her mind refused to process what it was seeing. The stack of documents in her hands slipped slightly against the edge of the table. "Vivian?" my father said, my name so softly there was barely any breath behind it. I closed the door behind me and walked to the other end of the table. "Good morning." He stood up immediately. His first instinct was not shame, It was not apology, it was still the oldest reflex he had, seize back control. My God, he said, a strained smile appearing too quickly on his face, pale with shock. Is that really you? We had no idea. Vivian, this is incredible. If your mother could see this. He stopped, then added in a warmth so fake it almost hurt to hear. We always knew you were special. I did not sit. I laid one hand on the back of the chair and looked at him for a long time, long enough for the smile to begin hardening on his face. No, I said. You didn't. Madison looked away first. My father still tried to keep himself composed. Vivian, I know things in the past were not perfect, but who among us hasn't handled things badly at times? What matters is that you've done extraordinary things and family. Family? I repeated, not loudly, but enough to stop him in the middle of the sentence. You mean the family that laughed at my dream? The family that wanted to take my savings to patch over Madison's mistakes? The family that told me if I didn't comply, I could leave? Madison inhaled sharply, her voice thin and hurried. Vivian, that was 10 years ago. I know, I said, my eyes still on my father. That's exactly why this sounds even clearer now. He tried to cut in, his voice lower. You don't understand the pressure we were under then. I gave a very slight nod. No, I understand it very well. And I understand one other thing too. I pulled out my chair and finally sat down across from them. The difference between us is simple, Dad. When I had a future, you laughed at it. Now that you've lost yours, you want me to fund it. The room went so quiet I could hear the air system change rhythm. My father looked at me as if he were still waiting for some hidden door to open, some old soft place in me to return just in time to save him. Vivian, he said, lowering his voice, almost pleading now, though still trying to preserve the shape of dignity. This isn't just a company. There are people in it, assets, reputation, a whole life's work. You don't have to do this for me. Look at it as a business decision. I opened the folder in front of me, turned a few pages, and looked at the long stretches of red numbers running quarter after quarter. Exactly. Then let's speak as a business decision. I set the file back down. This agency is poorly managed, weak at retaining clients, bloated in operations, and dependent on rescue capital to drag forward something already rotten from the inside. This is a bad investment. Madison blurted out, almost unable to stop herself. You're doing this because you hate us? I turned to her. No. If it were hate, I would have built my life around the day you failed. I didn't. I built it away from you. My father sat down slowly, as if the bones in his body had suddenly grown heavier. In his eyes for the first time I saw not power, not mockery, but the emptiness of a man who finally understands that some doors, once closed, do not open again, simply because you share the same blood. I pushed the folder back toward them. I am not investing. There was no shouting, no dramatic exchange like the kind people like to watch in movies on a weekend. There was only a decision that was clear, cold, right, and in no need of justification. They left less than 10 minutes later. Sarah closed the door softly behind them, the same way she did with every meeting that failed. I remained alone in the glass room, looking down at the city, at the lines of cars moving slowly through the drizzle, and realized that the most peaceful thing was not seeing them fall apart. The most peaceful thing was knowing I no longer needed any acknowledgement from them at all. Even if their company collapsed afterward, even if the old house was sold, even if their social standing slipped away like peeling paint on a wall left unrepaired too long, none of that was my victory. My real victory had come long ago, on the night I walked out of that house with my old laptop against my chest and never looked back. Because in the end, what freed me was not their finally seeing my worth. It was that I no longer needed them to. Maybe in the end, what healed me was not watching them lose the things they once used to hurt me. What healed me was understanding that I could still live a full, peaceful, valuable life without any of them ever acknowledging it. If this story touched something in you, I hope you'll stay with me for more by subscribing to the channel. And if you want, leave me a comment telling me where you're watching from, or whether there was ever a moment in your life when you had to choose yourself.